is the DAWbench Radio Show, the official podcast of DAWbench.com.
Welcome to the DAWbench Radio Show. I am your host, Vin Curigliano of AAVIM Technology in Melbourne, Australia. And I'm joined again by my co-host, Pete Brown of Microsoft in Maryland in the United States. How you going, Pete?
Vin, great. I'm so happy. We just finished recording all of our build sessions for our event later this month, so my head is finally clear.
Yeah, that was a bit of a brain strain. I realized that you'd kind of gone a bit of radio silence there for a while, but that's so that went well?
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about what we're going to show off there.
Okay, awesome. And so I'll be tuning in on that one. Now, today we have a very special guest who's coming in from San Jose in California in the United States, and that is Evan Brooks. Now, Evan is the co-founder of Digidesign, that without question, we're one of the principal pioneers and leading innovators in music technology and computer-based digital audio solutions over the last 4 decades. Welcome, Evan.
Thank you, Vin. Good morning.
Good morning to you. And it's actually afternoon for you guys, and at slightly different timelines. You guys are on opposite coasts over there in the United States. Now, just to start off, the reason I used a past tense for Digidesign was that it is now operating under the brand name of Avid, obviously. And one thing that I did discover during my research and refresher for the show is that the Avid association with Digidesign goes back a lot longer than I first realized. And also my personal interaction with the company's products goes even further back. During one of our pre-chats with Evan, I remembered a product that I came across in the late 80s, pre the digital audio days. And then I connected the dots that, my association with Digidesign goes back, like even further than the Pro Tools days. So it's let's just say it's in multiple decades. I think what would be really great, though, Evan, is if you can give us an overview of your personal history regards music, technology, and computers, and how that led you to founding the company.
Well, it's a long story.
Oh, we've got plenty of time.
It goes back a ways, too, like everything else that you've mentioned.
Yep.
But it's probably not unlike a lot of other people's stories in this business, I would imagine, because this business didn't really exist before most of us started working in it. So we all came to it as a result of our own personal interests and talents and predilections, and I was no different in that regard. I've been a musician all my life. I've been an engineer. Scholastically, academically, professionally. I have a electrical engineering degree from college, and I've always tried to put those two things together. It's going all the way back to, probably early high school days. I'd be the guy in the electronics class who was building a modular synthesizer, and everybody else were building sirens or something like that.
That's awesome.
So it was always, these were two great interests in my life, and I was fortunate, like so many of us, to be doing this and be alive in a time when you could actually put these two things together in a way that was within reach of a normal person. That I didn't need to have Frankensteinian electronics to be making things, and I could afford to cobble together things. And one of the seminal moments in that whole development was when Craig Anderton released his Electronic Projects for Musicians book, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there's anybody in my vintage of working in this business that wasn't heavily influenced by that book. And there were many times when I would show up to a band rehearsal with some new box in tow that I had just made from the book.
That's great.
and not all of them were well received. I remember in particular the ring modulators drew a lot of ire. But
yeah.
But those were good days because if you wanted to make something like that, I mean, you literally had to make it. I mean, I had to go and make my own printed circuit boards, and that involved getting solutions of acid and things like that. And it wasn't out of anybody's reach, but it was pretty hands-on stuff, and gave me a good respect for what it took to make something really. And so that's what I started with, was an interest in electronics and interest in music. And I'd been playing in bands since I was a young teenager, and we had a couple bands at high school, one of which lasted through college and beyond. And that in that band was my friend Peter Gocher, who started Digidesign with me. He was the drummer in the band, so we went back a long ways. And let's see, I don't know how to dovetail all this together for you in an easy way, because it kind of comes from so many different octopus tendrils of events that have happened. But I think the basic idea was that having that interest in electronics and music ended up filtering its way into the band. And so, like I said, I would be making my own effects devices. Certainly when you're in a band and when you're recording, as we were, you start getting handy at studio wiring, and Peter had gone to a recording school after graduating from college. We had both gone to UC Berkeley, and he graduated. He was a year ahead of me,
right?
And he went from there into a recording school. So armed with all that knowledge, we started recording as a band, and so the electronics, fit right into that, and that really led directly into Digidesign because of digital drum machines and their emergence at that time.
Yeah, so that was a really great story with the Drumulator. So how that kind of kicked off the whole thing for you guys.
Yeah, that was truly fortuitous.
Yeah,
and I say that with all reverence because there are people who believe that there might be some kind of magical formulas to divine from different people's stories, especially ones that were successful. And I have to really believe that so much of it is good fortune in so many different ways. And to have been interested in what I was interested in at the time, where certain technologies were available, and also at a time in my life where I could take risks and just kind of, follow my own desires. All those things, coming together were extremely enormous amount of good fortune. And the story with Emu just really adds on to that. I rather doubt it would be easy to make any of this happen if you tried to on purpose.
Yeah, yeah. So can you actually give us the detail of that story with how that whole Drumulator and your EPROM history came about, because that's an awesome story.
Yeah, it's a crazy story, but it's all true.
Yep.
And it's something I have a lot of appreciation and gratitude for. So we're out of college, and we've been building a recording studio. My father had a medical office in San Mateo, and in the back of the lot was an old garage. I guess it must have used to have been a residential facility or something, but there was a standalone garage in the back that nobody was using. And my dad basically gave it to the band and said, "Here, you can use this to rehearse in."
Perfect.
Which was wonderful. What a gift. And so we set about basically tearing it down from the inside out and building a recording studio in it. And we would take all of our spare money at that time, because we were all working, and we would basically spend our money on recording equipment.
Yep.
And so, one day, one of the guys came back with a multi-track reel-to-reel, and then Peter came back with a small mixing desk, and we had effects boxes here and there, and reverbs and compressors. And one day, Peter shows up with a EMU Drumulator, and the significance of it is that this was in probably 1983 when the Drumulator had first come out, and it was only a couple of years, I think, since Roger Lynn had released the Lynn drum.
Yes.
And so that was a really big deal, because that was the first drum machine that used digital samples as the sound source. And prior to that, you had what were essentially rhythm boxes, which were analog percussive-ish sound makers that played back canned rhythms. And so you'd press the cha-cha button and you'd get the and the irony there, of course, is that was the TR-808 popularized that whole set of sounds. But that was all you could do. And so I don't think it really ever moved anybody very much. And but when the Lynn drum came out, suddenly it changed everything, really. And ironically, Peter, being a drummer, was probably the last person I would have expected, that would have been interested in something like this. But he was really very curious too, and he was very technically astute. And when the Drumulator came out, it was $995, and up till then, the only choice really had been the Lynn drum, which was about $5,000.
Yes, unbelievable, yeah.
Yeah, and mere mortals, especially kids right out of college, nobody can afford something like that. So everybody just we read a keyboard magazine and we salivate over this stuff, but or we're reading Mix magazine or wherever it is, and suddenly EMU comes out with something that looks like it's pretty much similar at under $1,000 barely. So Peter jumps on it and buys one, and he brings it back to the studio and figures out how to use it, and we start recording with it. And this is new to us, because up till then we had never been recording with a click track. We'd just been, the Beatles weren't recording with click tracks either. It was just you just record as a band.
Yes.
And so we had to learn how to record in a different way, and it was a lot of fun, and it was different. And after about 2 weeks or so, Peter asks me, he says, "Ev, can you, I'm getting really sick of the sounds in this thing. Because it comes with a set of 12 sounds, right? Yep. And those are the sounds you get. And if you want a different sounding bass drum or different sounding snare drum or cymbal, tough. And I think for somebody who isn't a drummer or percussionist, that might actually be okay, or maybe even comforting in a way. But for somebody who was as consummate of a drummer as Peter, then your whole deal is about being able to create a whole palette of sounds, and you have lots of instruments at your disposal. And not only that, you can take a given drum and play it so many different ways and get a lot of different sounds out of it.
No, of course. Yeah.
So he was kind of distressed after a couple of weeks that although the drum machine was really flexible, you couldn't do anything with the sound. So he says, "Hey, Ev, can you change the sounds?" And I looked at him, I said, "Sure." And I had the faintest idea how to change the sounds in that drum machine. But I think what "sure" probably meant was, God, I'd really like to figure out how to do that.
Yeah.
And I think that's also a very typical engineer answer, is you kind of, say yes first and then figure out how to do it.
Yep.
Every marketing discussion.
Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. And I apologize in advance for all engineers. But the results made up for it. And so I thought about it for a little while, and then I did what any good engineer would do, is that I called EMU, the manufacturer. I said, "How do you change the sounds in your drum machine?" And they said, "Well, there is actually a way, and we've actually written it up, and we've actually given it to a number of people who have asked about it, but no one's ever done anything with that information.
Right.
And frankly, we're kind of disincented from putting out this effort anymore. And I said, I totally understand. And you don't know me from Adam. But I promise you that if you let me know how to do this, not only will I do something with it, but I will bring it back and I will show it to you.
Yeah, awesome.
And that was absolutely my intention. And so they said, okay. And they sent me this, God, I probably still have it somewhere. It's like 3 or 4 page write-up. And they explained to me that the way it works is that they used the digital sampling keyboard that they had earlier developed called the Emulator.
Yes, of course. Yep.
Which recorded 8-bit companded. Mm-hmm. I don't even remember what the sampling rate was. It was some weird sampling rate, like 27 or 28 kilohertz.
Right, non-standard.
Yeah. Well, there were no standards back then anyway.
That's what I meant, yeah. Yeah.
And they said you record audio into the emulator, and then you take this special floppy disk, because that's what the emulator ran on, this special floppy disk that has a special operating system software on it that we've written. And what that lets you do is it lets you take a sound that's been recorded into the emulator, and it will dump it out the DB25 connector.
Right.
There was an RS-232C DB25 connector in the back of the emulator that most people probably never gave a second thought to, because you couldn't do anything with it.
Correct, yeah.
But it turns out you actually could. So what this meant was that we had to go out and buy an emulator.
Right.
And it was actually worse than that, because they said, well, once you dump it out the emulator, then you got to figure out some way to take that data and massage it into a certain format and then burn it onto these memory chips.
Okay.
And then you replace the set of 5 memory chips that are in the drum machine with a new set of 5 chips. You have to replace, the way that drum machine worked is you had to replace all the sounds at once.
Right.
You couldn't, as you could with some later drum machines, you couldn't just say replace the snare drum.
Right. Yep.
So fortunately, EMU had been, I don't know if it was prescient or if there was some engineering compelling reason to do this, but they had all 5 of those chips in sockets. Nowadays, you'd never see anybody doing that because sockets are notoriously unreliable.
Correct, yeah.
Especially over long periods of time.
Mm-hmm.
So what we ended up doing was Peter and I decided to split the cost of buying an emulator. So we found somebody that was selling an emulator. I don't know, it probably cost us $5,000 or $7,000 or something like that. I don't remember.
Just the price of a car.
Yeah.
Seriously, it was like more expensive than the car I owned.
Yep.
And so we split that, and I had a computer that I had been building since college. When I was at Berkeley, I ended up doing some consulting work for Leo's Music, which was do you know who Leo's Music was, Vin? I don't know if that gets halfway around the world or not.
That's not. Look, I know most of the larger, better known music retailers. In America, I hadn't heard of Leo's. Where was that?
Leo's was in Oakland.
Right.
I think it was on Telegraph Avenue. So in the Bay Area, Leo's was a big thing. But this is way before the internet and anything like that. So it was all kind of local.
Yep.
And Leo had been talked into opening a kind of an annex in a Victorian house next door to his music store, where he was going to sell digital music products, because digital music was suddenly a big possibility.
It was a thing, yeah.
It was a thing. And he had tapped me to kind of run the technology of that store. And they started out by selling sounds for the Synergy. Do you remember that synthesizer, digital synthesizer?
Yeah, but that's not the Synclavier. Is that the Synclavier? No.
No. The Synergy was a kind of a combination of FM and additive synthesis. It was all done in discrete hardware, and the way it worked is it had a cartridge that kind of looked like a game cartridge, and it had some memory chips inside of it that had the data for 2 different sounds. And you plug you plug this cartridge in, and you got to choose, one of 2 different sounds to play. And the marketing model they had for this, you'll appreciate this, Pete, is they had a programming system called a GDS. And I don't remember what that stood for, graphical display system maybe, or something. But basically what it was a CPM-based computer that ran the software that allowed you to, it kind of essentially was like a programmer librarian. It allowed you to actually create all the parameters for these FM-ish sounds and audition them. And then when you liked them, you would actually burn them to some memory chips, and you would plug those into the cartridges and sell them to the user. Right. And so the company that was making this had these dreams that they would have these GDS systems, which probably cost $30,000 or $35,000 each, installed all over the country, and users would flock to these things and pay whatever, $50 or $100. I don't remember what the price was, to have some sounds burnt onto some cartridges for them.
Right. Okay.
And that was the idea. And so I was the one that was installing and operating this GDS system, and that whole gig led into another project that Leo wanted to do, which was to try to make I don't know what you'd call it. He wanted me to modify an early Casio electronic keyboard to basically have a built-in sequencer. Kind of wanted to make it more kind of a professional product where you could kind of record and play back multi-track music.
MIDI sequencing. MIDI sequencing, right?
Yeah, but before MIDI, this wasn't connecting to anything else. It was all meant to just kind of be built in. So if you could kind of remember those old Casio keyboards that had, I don't know what they were, some kind of synthetic sounds, some kind of synthesis they were using.
Yep.
Phase modulation or something. And so he wanted me to basically hack one of those things and build a sequencer into it. So to do that, I put together a computer. This is built around back then what were called S100 bus computers, which was a bus standard, and it was running, the operating system it was running was the same thing. Actually, they were running on the GDS was CPM, which was a reasonable operating system for that type of thing. Mm-hmm. And I designed my own hardware for the computer that would then tap into the circuits in the Casio, and then I could write, using assembly language on the computer, I could write code that would implement a sequencer on the Casio. And so that's how I ended up having kind of a hacked up homebrewed computer at that time.
So that was the Plywood Computer that there's some photos of on the internet, correct?
Yeah, and that's not the computer. That's just the terminal.
Right.
That's just the terminal.
Yeah.
The computer itself looked like what you might see in a hobbyist magazine. It was a big rack mounted frame that had a power supply and whatever it was, 8 or 10 or 12 slots for cards. This is back when if you wanted memory in your computer, you bought an S100 bus card that had 32K of memory on it, which was a big deal.
Yeah.
Because I think my first cards were like 8K of memory, and you'd stick 3 or 4 or 5 of them in there.
But did you have switches and blinking lights on the front panel? That's the real question.
No, because that was different. Those were actually like entire computers in one. Those were like if you'd buy an Altair or an IMSA computer, they would have the whole thing hooked up, and they would have the CPU card in there hooked up to front panel switches. And this was more of a really low level raw sort of computer where you'd have a card in there, and if you wanted to program it or anything, you had to hook something up to it.
Yep.
And so for me, that was hooking up a video terminal.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Which
around what year was that?
Oh, I don't know. I was probably making this around 1981, maybe 82.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. There are a bunch of, because I've seen a bunch of history lately about some of these old CPM kit computers and stuff from that time, all S100 based. Like there was a German magazine that had plans for it and other stuff. So if you knew where to look, it was pretty interesting.
Yeah, it was state of the art at that time. I remember thinking, God, I've got a laboratory, in my room, and they generated a lot of heat. You didn't have to heat your apartment. You had fans, they were noisy as all hell. But it was a miracle back then. I mean, to me, it was, being able to write your own code, to program something. What was the first programming that you ever did? What device was it on?
It was a CPM computer. It was like a DEC Robin or something like that. And it was BASIC on there. So I'm probably about 10 years later than you. So a little late for the homebrew stuff, but in on the early commercialized stuff. Okay.
Yes. And so for me, my first experience of programming actually was on an HP calculator. HP came out with programmable calculators in the 70s, right. And you would store the expensive models. They actually had a magnetic strip reader on it, and they had these little magnetic strips that kind of looked like I don't know what people use for diabetic testing now. And you'd slide it through there, and it would store and read and write programs that you could save. And then the later ones, I think they would just store in memory, and you couldn't take them out. But that was my first experience. And so being able to kind of program in general and affect something more than a calculator was really, it was an amazing feeling.
I like the way you thought about this project, though, where you asked for a sequencer. So you said, I'm going to build a computer. And that's where you went with that.
Well, I had to. I had no other way to do it. And the idea was that if he was going to commercialize this product, that computer would be a microprocessor built into the Casio-like thing. Mm. So I just basically made myself a development system. I didn't know what a development system was, but that's what it eventually became. So that's how I happened to have a computer system. In 1983, when Peter bought this Drumulator. So we bought this emulator. Got the special software from them for the on the floppies, and I hooked it up to the computer that I had, and I wrote a bunch of software for that computer to download the software or download the audio from the emulator and format it into the special format that they needed to go into these chips. And then I had to get a board for the computer that actually would burn these memory chips. And then we had to go out and buy a bunch of memory chips, which were not cheap. And lo and behold, after a few months of work, we had something. Peter had this very extensive collection of ethnic percussion instruments. He had a lot of Latin and African percussion instruments, and we had a friend who had some electronic drums, who brought those over that we were able to sample, and we ended up making, I think it was like 4 different sets of chips, like an African percussion, a Latin percussion, and maybe a couple of electronic sets, something to that effect. And they were 4 completely different replacement sets of chips. And we brought them over to EMU, and this must have been late, like in the fall or something like that of 1983. And the entire company, EMU was not a large company, but the whole company turned out for this. And nice. We were all in a big room, and we demoed the sounds, and just you could hear everybody's jaws hitting the floor. It was it was palpable, and it's not like they were surprised that it could be done, because obviously they had used the same technique to make their sounds in the first place. But I don't know. I kind of liken it to like when Henry Ford came out with the Model T. What's that famous thing that you could have any color you wanted as long as it was black?
As long as it was black, right. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and so he wasn't really thinking about what the effect of having personalized colors would be like. And so I imagine that he might have been surprised to have seen somebody show up with a rainbow full of colors in their cars. Mm-hmm. And I think EMU was had the same kind of an effect. Is it got them thinking, and the thinking that they were doing out loud at that event was that their salespeople could sell a whole lot more when they went around the country to visit dealers if they had all these alternate sound sets with them, saying, "Hey, and look, it does this." Mm-hmm. So they ordered like 20 sets of chips from us that day.
Wow!
And we didn't we didn't go there with the intention of selling any chips to anybody.
Typical engineer.
No, seriously, because we were busy. Peter and I both had full-time jobs, and the time that we weren't spending on our jobs, we were spending playing music, and so that just wasn't really in our minds. And we didn't mind spending the money we did on it because it was for us too, right? We were making sounds for us. But when they said that, it was it changed everything, because suddenly we were given a whole different set of possibilities, right? Because here's an order for 20 sets of chips, and we're thinking to ourselves, well, we've already made these chips. It's not much more work to just copy them and put labels on them. And so that's what we did. We hadn't intended to do it, but we said okay, and we went and we made the chips for them, and very uncharacteristically for most companies, we officially became profitable on our first day.
Yeah.
And so that's very unusual, as you know. And and it changed our thinking entirely, because at that point, our thinking started going, God, that wasn't too difficult. Maybe what we can do is, do some more of this. Maybe other people might want this, and we can make more money to buy more recording equipment, which is where our heads were at the time.
Yep.
And that's what we ended up doing. But I think the more amazing part of all this that I haven't even mentioned, and I think this is perhaps underappreciated because most people don't realize this, is EMU really gave us a start in this business. Not just by making this initial order, because that by itself wouldn't have done it. But what EMU did was really incredible, and I don't think that you would ever find a company that would do it nowadays. Certainly, because things have changed so much. But we didn't just drive home from there. And EMU was close by, so we just drove over there. They were in Santa Cruz over the hill. We left there with a number of things. We left there with their entire user database for Drumulators.
Wow.
So, and when I say with their database, you have to think about what a database was in 1983. Their database were card files. There were metal drawers that were probably 4 feet long each.
Yeah.
Filled with these cards that were, kind of serrated cards that were torn out from the back of the Drumulator manuals that you would get with your Drumulator.
Yeah.
And there were thousands of these cards. I can't remember how many drawers, 4 feet long each, that we had in our car. It was a lot. And so we had what in today's parlance would be called a 100% targeted database, which, is pretty hard to come by. Plus, and if that wasn't enough, they gave us their entire U.S. dealer network and their international distributor network.
Yep.
And personally set us up with all those people. And if that wasn't enough, they included our product in their advertising and gave us space in their trade show booths for a number of years after that.
Wow. That's amazing.
So
yeah.
it was unbelievable. And I have to say that was a key component to our early success. And it wouldn't have happened without people like Dave Rossum and Marco Alpert and Scott Wedge, who were running EMU and who were just really great people. And they saw the benefit in this, for themselves, obviously, but I think they also were just being genuinely kind by giving us a head start in all this. Yeah. And so it was extraordinary. It was certainly an unusual introduction to the world of business for me, because I don't think at that time I recognized how special that was, but certainly over the years, I have voiced my appreciation for it, because it was very unexpected and incredibly magnanimous of them to do something like that.
Yeah, that was pretty amazing of them.
Yeah, that would be Well, to say that would be rare in this current environment would be an understatement. I don't think you're going to get a company that's going to be sharing IP and dealer and user databases and to dealer direct access to dealer networks. That was amazing, Evan. Now, and the company initially wasn't called Digidesign; it was called Digidrums. Am I correct there?
Absolutely right.
Yeah. So, at what point did it go from Digidrums to Digidesign?
Well, so in the fall of '83, we made it an official company, Digidrums, and in the following spring, in April, I think it was April of '84, we actually incorporated, and we incorporated as Digidesign Inc. And the thinking was, by then, we were humming along as a company, and we're starting to think that we didn't necessarily want to pigeonhole ourselves into just drum chips. So we didn't know what the future was going to bring, but we thought it might be better just as a corporate name to have something that wasn't entirely focused on drum chips. And so,
of course.
So we used a little bit more of a generic name.
Mm-hmm. Well, the name may have been generic, but it definitely left a huge footprint in the industry.
Well, yeah, the work we did. I don't know about the name, but names are actually a funny thing because I think the thing that Digi is best known for, obviously, is Pro Tools, and so we would get people calling up all the time asking, if this was Pro Tools, if this was the company. They would refer to the company as Pro Tools.
Yeah, right. Yeah, of course.
And so it was pretty hard in people's minds sometimes to disentangle names.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Pro Tools almost became like a synonymous to like a pseudonym for digital audio recording. Like Google has become a synonymous with searching. People don't say, "Oh, I'm going to go search for something." They say, "I'll go Google something."
Yeah. Well, luckily, Pro Tools never became a verb.
Yeah, well, you know what, Evan? I reckon it did because you could go up to a person that's not that's not in the music industry, and if like people would be asking me, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm a digital audio solutions provider. I build digital audio workstations." And they go, "What are they?" And I've gone, Pro Tools. And they go, "Oh yeah." So if I say Pro Tools, they know what I'm talking about. If I say, Cubase or Studio One or, any of the others, I'll go, "What? I don't even know what they are." But so don't.
Yeah, the names become synonymous with digital recording.
Yeah, digital audio recording. So one of your products before Pro Tools, this is the one I wanted to have a bit of a chat about because we discussed this in our pre-chat, and that was Sound Designer. So that was a first software product. Do you want to give us a bit of an overview on that one?
Yeah, actually, Sound Designer wasn't the first software product.
Oh.
Funny enough.
Right.
The first software product was, this is a long time ago. So when we started working on software, we hired a software engineer who actually went to high school with us. A fellow named Mark Jeffrey, who you've been speaking to.
Yes.
And so he was our first engineering hire. And the first thing that he did is he wrote essentially a MIDI recorder. He might have written the very first MIDI recorder.
Right. Okay.
In history. And it looked like a cassette player with a cassette in it that had the little rotating wheels and everything.
Right.
And it would record and play back tracks of MIDI. So it didn't have, I don't recall that it necessarily had any or much editing, but it was certainly kind of using the consumer recording metaphor on MIDI data. Mm-hmm. And I think that was officially our first software product. But
what was that? What was that called, Evan? Can you remember?
Probably MIDI recorder.
Again, engineers.
Yeah, right.
Honestly, I don't remember. I don't remember. But I think you're right though. In terms of our first kind of major software product, it was Sound Tools or sort of Sound Designer rather.
Yep.
And that developed actually out of the drum chips.
Yes.
which was kind of an unusual way to to get a software product. But it turned out that if you record and edit enough digital drum sounds that you're trying to compress the heck out of and shorten up and take noise and top the head and tail and so on and so forth.
Of course.
You find that you actually want to have a visual interface for doing that.
Yep.
And originally I didn't. When we were making the original sets of Drumulator sounds, the only thing that I had to edit on was that Plywood terminal that you saw there. And so that was, you may remember what like original, IBM PC terminals look like, right? They were just alphanumeric terminals that had whatever it was, 24 rows by 80 columns or something like that. It was all alphanumeric characters, and that was it. You didn't have pixel map displays at that time.
Yeah, like the Ensoniq Mirage editing.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Imagine a giant screen of Ensoniq Mirage LEDs.
Yeah.
So what I learned to do is we learned how to interpret screenfuls of kind of flowing ASCII characters as waveforms.
Yep.
And you'd start to learn, where the zero crossings were and, what was noise. And it was insane, really, if when I think back on it, but that's really all we had.
Yep.
And when the Mac first came out in 1984, because we were, technology heads, we went out and got a couple. We signed up for the Apple Developer Program, and the first thing I thought of when I looked at these Macintosh screens was, oh my God, you could draw waveforms on this.
Right.
Literally, that was the first thing that popped into my mind.
Yeah, of course.
And so I thought, God, my life would just be so much easier if I could just take these digital sounds that I've been editing using screenfuls of ASCII and on this CPM computer and just kind of transfer them over digitally to the Mac computer so I could see them on the screen and figure out where I should be placing my edits. Right? And just say, oh yeah, that's this point in the file, and then go back into the CPM machine and say, cut it at this point. So I wrote some code because we became Apple developers. I learned how to program the Mac and wrote some code to do that transfer of audio over. And once the audio was over onto the Mac and you could see it in a beautiful waveform, I started, trying to work that way. And I started thinking, God, why am I even transferring this thing back to the CPM computer? Why don't I just do all the editing on this end? And then when I'm done, just send the whole sound file back to the CPM computer and have it burnt onto chips.
Yep.
Because it just made more sense rather than going back and forth all the time. So that's where Sound Designer came from, was the need to do that. And so Sound Designer was originally written to move the sounds from my computer, but what we ended up doing was using the latest version of the Emulator as the sound source. So EMU came out with the Emulator 2 at some point. This must have been, I don't know, 85, 86 or something like that.
Yeah, it would have been around that time, yeah.
And so it also had a computer port on it. And so I wrote the code to basically download sound files that had been sampled onto that over to the Mac, turn it into a sound file, do all your editing on the Mac, or your cut and paste editing, because at that time it was all destructive editing. And then when you got what you wanted, you'd send it back to the emulator, and that's what you'd play. And it turned out that improved people's productivity with the emulator. I don't know, tenfold. I don't know what it was.
Of course it would. Of course it would have, yeah.
Because the emulator had this really handy, 2-line LCD character display to do all of your detailed editing on.
Yep. Very, very much like the Ensoniq. We had that discussion in the pre-chat.
Not much better
with the Mirage. I don't know how I managed to do anything on that, but like you said, necessity is the mother of invention. I managed somehow to do some sampling.
Literally,
in it. Yeah.
Literally, it's the mother of invention.
Crazy stuff. So, Sound Designer eventually, you expanded that to so that we were supporting a whole stack of samplers from memory.
We did. We kind of followed the same path that we did with the drum chips. With the drum chips, we gave EMU an exclusive because other companies started coming out with budget digital drum machines pretty quickly.
Yep, of course, yeah.
And because EMU had been so incredibly kind and generous to us, we gave them an exclusive for, I don't know, it was at least a year or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And one by one, the other drum machine companies were coming to us saying, hey, we want to have your sound library on our machine. And so after a period of time, we started doing that. And then at some point, pretty much every drum machine had the library on it. And so it wasn't it became a checklist item instead of an advantage.
Yep, of course, yeah.
And so the same thing happened with Sound Designer. When we released it for the Emulator 2, we gave them an exclusive for a long time. And then as the other companies started coming out with inexpensive digital sampling keyboards, we would adapt Sound Designer to those different models that would come out.
Yeah. And the interesting thing for me was that, I had this very vague recollection that Sound Designer, I was sure that I saw it on my old Atari ST, and I wasn't sure, but that that's something that you confirmed for me during that chat, because you never see it mentioned in if you go through all of the history stuff for Digidesign, and there's a stack of articles out there. Not one of them mentioned that Sound Designer actually also ran on the ST, but I do remember it distinctly being on the ST because that was my first foray into computers.
I think that was our first attempt to try to broaden the usefulness or the appeal of the program, and the ST was very popular in certain circles in Europe.
Yes.
And it was lower cost than the Macintosh, and so that was our first attempt to do that. I don't think that it went terribly well.
No,
but it was. I mean, it went well, and then it produced, workable product, and we ended up designing a DSP card for it as well.
Yep.
So we had to adapt our designs, but it was certainly a learning process. Having to have two different code bases working on the same product.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of all the cool things now I missed out on being a Commodore guy at the time. So,
well, you probably also got a lot of good things that a lot of other people didn't get. Like, you'd say that about any platform.
Yeah, fair.
that had a brief life, like BOS or Amiga or any of those things. I think they all had their time in the sun, and they all brought, I think, some really important changes overall to the industry and kind of raised the bar in general for what people should expect.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, look, Atari was never really an audio thing. It was more MIDI sequencing. MIDI, that's where
right.
that's where its power lay, because it had the MIDI interface built into it, and the timing on it was just incredible. And I'm still hesitant to think that that still hasn't been matched. I'd love to go back to an Atari and just play some of those sequences just to remember how tight that whole timing was. Because I remember once I moved off the Atari and then moved on to Windows, it was like it wasn't even comparable. The timing was disgraceful for a long time on the Windows platform in those early, mid to middle-ish 90s. It did improve, obviously, but yeah.
That's one of those unfortunate ironies of technology that even though things have gotten a lot more complicated and powerful, in a way they're a lot less precise and immediate because you're farther and farther away from the hardware.
Right? Yeah.
So it's nice to have a serial connection right off the CPU.
Oh yeah, of course.
It is, and even better is to basically have an interrupt structure in the CPU that allows servicing of that serial port very quickly.
Right,
and that's really what's missing right now is that kind of immediacy of response when now we've got so many other things that are competing for the attention of the CPU, and you just can't get immediate response.
Yep.
So the next move, Evan, was sound tools. Now, this is where we started moving into, professional digital audio production on computers. And that was without a doubt, and I hate using the term, but that changed the game. Once sound tools hit the market, that definitely shifted the focus towards being able to produce digital audio on the computer. So can you give us some overview on that whole shift to the sound tools as well? Because it's not only the software. You guys were also developing accompanying hardware, and this is something that has been prominent and with the Digidesign product, is that it wasn't only software. You always matched it to hardware. And I mean, still to this day, you've still got Pro Tools HDX, So can you give us some overview on that? Because that really set the framework for what was to come later.
Yeah, you're right. That was the big change was moving from samples to sampling, I guess, yes. or I don't want to call it a linear digital audio, but just digital recording in general. Mm. And it was probably an inevitable transition, but it wasn't inevitable all the time, and it wasn't obvious at first because there were a couple of really big technological limitations. Originally trying to get enough memory to store longer periods of digital audio was really, really hard. Mm-hmm. It's very expensive, took up a lot of room. So you had samplers were popular because you could do a lot with small snippets of audio. Yes. And the audio, you didn't need to constantly be recording new audio. You could just have your bank of sounds and use them. And the other thing that was missing technologically was processing power, right? With a sampler, you had probably custom circuitry in there that implemented a bit of synthesis. They would have probably active filters and envelope generators and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And that was all done with hardware. But to do all the functions you would do in a normal recording studio, there just didn't exist the processing power for that. Yep. So how did we get from A to B? Well, it occurred over a period of a number of years. The general path followed the improvement of technology in general. If you just it all kind of followed Moore's law in a way. So memory started getting less expensive and available in larger quantities. Disk drives finally gave way to hard drives, which not only got larger and cheaper and faster, but more importantly, got fast enough so that you could play multiple channels of digital audio in real time without gaps. Yep. And without losing audio. And I don't know if you remember this, but original hard drives had to perform what was called a thermal recalibration procedure every so often. So as the drive would heat up, the metal would expand, and that would throw off. It would throw off the tracking of the read head, the read-write head over the platters, because the tracks were very narrow. And so what would happen is every random amount of time, it felt like, the drive would basically shut itself off from the outside world and go through this thermal recalibration procedure where it would seek to some sort of a known track and figure out how much expansion had occurred and use that to recalibrate its positioning.
No, that'd be brilliant for real-time audio.
Oh, believe me, it was. You have no idea how brilliant it was for our poor customer support department. So if you're recording or playing back and suddenly it goes offline, it was really exciting. And so, I would say that most of what we were doing for a long time was basically riding the bleeding edge of technology.
Oh, of course.
And I mean that in every sense of the word, because it was dangerous. And so I give great kudos to our customer support department, because their job, among other things, was helping people figure out what combination of equipment would be most reliable, right? So we had to constantly be testing hundreds and hundreds of different types of hard drives, of people's, SCSI interfaces, of just everything. People complain about, PCs being untestable because you could have literally any combination of stuff in there, but that problem existed with the Mac as well. And certainly it was, in the earlier days, it was much more acute because of the fact that we were on the bleeding edge, that stuff was just barely working. And there was such hunger for the ability to do this stuff out there, that people were willing to take on the risks of being on that bleeding edge and, sometimes falling over the edge of it. And that was just it came with the territory. And thankfully a lot of that has abated, with time, although now it's just kind of changed form in a way, right? Now the bleeding edge is how low can you make your buffers go without getting a glitch somewhere where it's going to be heard by somebody at the wrong time. Yeah. So I think this industry always is pushing the bleeding edge, but back then it was really rough. So hard drives, had to get to the point where they were, at least minimally functional. The memory was getting available. And we were following all this, and it was pretty clear after having Sound Designer out there for a number of years that the CPUs that we were running on, the Macs at that time, were just not powerful enough to do fast audio processing. And why do you want to do fast audio processing? Well, because we weren't just doing cut and paste editing. Remember back then there was no nonlinear editing because we were just creating whole sound files that were then getting used, as a whole unit by some sampler somewhere. Yep. So nonlinear editing, there was no point to it, and frankly, the disk drives were too slow to hop around anyway and play anything. And then the samplers, of course, themselves were treating sound files as contiguous linear pieces anyway. So, but we weren't just doing that. We were also doing processing. So we had modules in Sound Designer that were doing things like filtering and, dynamic range control and, so on and so forth. And those all took processing. I mean, even just like fading out a file, right? You're just, it's a very simple operation. You're just multiplying all the samples in the file by an ever shrinking number until it gets down to 0. So it's just a bunch of multiplies, but there's a lot of samples, and those multiplies take a long time, and you have to read the data from the disk, do the multiplies in memory, and then write it all back out to disk. So it takes a long time. And that in itself isn't a problem, but the problem is that the way that we as people edit is by using real-time modification. And so we have what's called a modify listen cycle when we edit. And so the way I like to think about it is if you wanted to go turn down the volume on your TV, you don't go over to the knob, turn it, and then wait 5 minutes and listen to the result and say, oh, dang it, that's not enough, and turn it a little bit more and wait another 5 minutes and go, oh yeah, I think that's about right. But that's literally what you had to do in Sound Designer if you wanted to do anything that really modified the sound in any kind of a comprehensive way. And so the modify listen cycle was broken, and that meant that people didn't really want to use it, and it was just so inefficient that it wasn't it was an important function, but it wasn't useful. So we spent a lot of energy trying to make all those things faster. How fast can you make an FFT run on a Motorola 68000? And it turns out you can actually make it run pretty fast, but you still can't do it fast enough for what you need to do. And so at some point we realized that we were screwed. Basically, we were at the mercy. Since we weren't making our own computers, so we were at the mercy of the Moore's law curve for CPUs. And that's an important point to make, because one of the major reasons why we were able to be successful with a product like Sound Tools and then later Pro Tools is that we didn't make our own computers. The companies that did, the companies or the institutions that had digital audio workstation like products on the market or available at that time all made their own systems from scratch. And so they made their own CPUs and did their own acceleration hardware and so on and so forth. And if you could imagine how much it would cost a company to kind of make their own computer, if instead of, downloading a Twitter app on your phone, if Twitter had to actually make the phone too, you can see the problem there.
Yep.
And so we were able to sell a system like Sound Tools for a couple $1,000s instead of a couple $100,000 because we didn't have to make the computer.
Correct. Yeah.
And so here we are. We're kind of stuck because we don't make the computer. We're at the mercy of how fast the computer is. And so fast forward to, 1986, 1987. At that time, hard drives finally became fast enough to play stereo digital audio in real time. Originally, it was only 8-bit that it could do. But actually, 8-bit digital audio at a 44 kilohertz sample rate sounds pretty darn good, especially compared to what you'd been hearing prior to that.
Yes, yep.
But we could see the writing on the wall. To me, that was a very eye-opening moment when I saw that could actually work. And so we started thinking, okay, how are we going to speed up the rest of this stuff? And at that time, I was approached by a friend from EMU, a guy named Terry Schultz, who was at that time, he had left EMU and he was working for a semiconductor company called Motorola. And Motorola had just come out with a digital signal processor that was specifically designed for audio. And when I say specifically designed, I'm referring mostly to the fact that it had a 24-bit fixed point word width. And up till then, most of the processors were designed for digital telephony or for video, and they had 8 or 16-bit fixed or floating point word widths, which were not really that great for digital audio. And so Motorola was trying to, they kind of come up with this processor, and they were trying to sell it into the audio market. And Terry was beating down my door saying, hey, you really need to try this. This is amazing, blah, 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 blah. And I wasn't, thinking about hardware at that time because we were a software company. I mean, that's right. That's how you could leverage not having an enormous pocketbook to produce products. And finally, one day I just gave in because Terry, it's really hard to say no to Terry. He's probably the nicest guy in the world. And sooner or later, he's like the best salesman ever because you just can't say no to him after a while. And so Terry sent me an evaluation sample of this processor and a computer board that it would go on, and then a development system with compilers and all sorts of stuff. And I designed a board that would go into the Mac. At that time, Apple had just come out with the Macintosh 2, which you might remember was Apple's first computer with real functional slots. They had come out with, I think it was like the Mac SE or something like that before, that had one in kind of a custom internal slot. But this was something that had an actual real standardized slot. They used NuBus for the standard.
Yep.
And the Mac 2s had 6 slots in them. They're big computers. And one of those slots got taken up by a video card, but really you had 5 slots to fool around with. So we were, part of Apple's developer program, and we kind of got onto the hardware part of that program. And I figured out how to basically design a NuBus card and put one of Terry's DSP chips on it. And when I had that working, I rewrote some of the sound designer code to send the audio data over to this card that I had written to do the processing and then send it back. And suddenly I'm able to do everything in real time. It was this hallelujah moment where the clouds opened up, and it was like, oh my God, you'd sit there in Sound Designer and you'd turn a knob on the screen and you would hear the change in the sound.
Yeah.
You're sweeping the center frequency of a filter. There it is. And it's like, oh my God. It was I can't even tell you. It was just this amazing moment. And then I added onto this card and added a high quality digital output, because up till that time we were using the 8-bit audio outputs of the Macs, and you know what those sounded like, and
glorious.
So yeah, so 16-bit stereo, integrated circuit digital analog converters were just becoming popular. And available at that time. I wouldn't say popular, I'd say available. People like Burr Brown and stuff were making them, and they used to be these really very kind of big, expensive things. And so now they came in a chip, and you'd combine them with this sort of a potted assembly of circuits that became the analog filter on the output. And so I put one of these, it was just mono, and I put it on the card, and suddenly I had a way to listen in real time in 16-bit 44 kilohertz glory. And it just all came together from there. It was like, oh my God, we have all the pieces now, right? We've got hard drives that can play audio in real time non-linearly. They can jump around. We've got a signal processor that can do all the processing that we need to do in real time. And we've got high quality audio outputs, and later we added inputs. And we realized that what we really had there was essentially a digital tape recorder / recording studio.
Yep, of course. Yeah.
And that's how we got from A to B. And you know, there was always this kind of a I don't want to say it's a goal that we were reaching for, but you know, like I said, there were people and there were institutions that had made systems like this already. You know, you had New England Digital with the Synclavier, and you had people like Lucasfilm who had done the Soundroid, and you know, Waveframe was making machines, and there were a number of other universities that had made stuff like that, and you know, Stanford had their machines at Karma, and so. We didn't in any sense invent the concept of a digital audio workstation. That was already out there. The problem was that nobody could afford one.
Well, I mean, Synclavier was, I think, the base thing. It was 25,000 to $250,000, and then we're talking late 70s, 80s. That's basically just for that's a university institution only. You know, look, obviously some rich musicians you know, better known musicians jumped onto that. Look, I remember just recently a friend of mine posted up a video of Chick Corea, one of the first electric bands, and he's on stage and they're comping away, and in the background there's a Synclavier with a Mac 2 with editing software, and he just posted a question. He goes, "What the hell is running on that Mac in the background?" I went, "Well, it's a Synclavier. It was probably more than likely editing software. It would have to be Sound Designer, wouldn't it? Or did Synclavier have their own editing on the Mac?"
I have to assume they had their own, because we never did anything for it.
Oh, you didn't do anything for Synclavier? Oh, okay.
No.
All right. So there you go.
No, and the marketing model for the Synclavier was that they were attempting to sell those to a certain number of high-end recording studios. And the idea was that the studios would distinguish themselves by virtue of having this, and they could charge really high rates for using it, and therefore over some time pay back the investment, or maybe it was a loss leader for them.
Yeah. Well, look, Fairlight was out there as well, but I mean, Fairlight, the majority of people that were using Fairlight weren't using them as recording systems from memory. They were using them as just these really high-end sampling instruments. You know, and look, they were amazing, and there was an Australian innovation there back in the mid '80s there. So
absolutely,
but they weren't. I never regarded the Fairlight as a recording system. I think by the time we got to Fairlight 3, they were actually implementing some multi-track stuff. I think but it was again
most of those systems eventually started adding features to try to become recording systems, but the biggest problem was that none of them were in a position to, nor were they designed to be mass market.
No, products. I mean, Fairlight Fairlight's here again. We're in $100,000 to $200,000 range in the 80s, and we're looking at it going. So when we saw one on stage, we're going, well, is that a loaner, or are these guys cashed up and coughed up a couple of $100,000 for a sampler? Essentially.
Yeah, it's true. And so we were all aware of all these products, obviously, and we all, lusted after them as poor musicians. And so for us, the ability to kind of do much, if not most of what you could do with those systems in something that was only a couple $1,000s.
Yep.
It was huge. And it was, I think that's kind of really what drove us and propelled us to make something like Sound Tools work, is because we realized at that point in time that we could do it.
Yep. And then look, and again, that changed the game. And then the move to multi-track recording with Pro Tools One. And now that one was interesting because look, I've been around Pro Tools since those early, 92, 93. And I remember, again, I had to do a bit of a refresher, but Pro Tools One was not really Pro Tools. It was marketed as Pro Tools, but it was actually two pieces of software from OSC, and I remember DEC, and so all of this stuff is flooding back, Evan, and I've gone, hang on, I remember that. So can you give us your take on that move to Pro Tools One, and then eventually to Pro Tools Two? But Pro Tools One was an interesting one for me because you'd partnered up with OSC to actually package that together with your hardware and their software.
Kind of.
Okay.
Kind of is a little bit more complicated. But,
okay. Sorry.
No. Those were interesting days, and I think we were all learning a lot about a lot of things. The very least of which was creating complex systems for a hungry market. Well, what I would say is that what Sound Tools did was that it showed us that there was definitely a market for these affordable digital audio workstations. Mm-hmm. And Sound Tools was it was two channels, obviously, and it was really meant kind of for applications where two channels were kind of the norm. So for mastering typically, or different kinds of production that didn't need multiple channels.
Yes.
A lot of radio stations used them and so on. But once we realized that we could do Sound Tools, and we could, in our minds, fast forward the Moore's Law trajectory of everything, it was clear that the multiple channels were going to be doable at some point. And because I was working full time on Sound Tools, I was the only software engineer on the sound designer part of it. Peter put together an entirely different team of people that went and did Pro Tools.
Right.
So I think a lot of what was done in Pro Tools was informed by kind of what we had been learning throughout the development of Sound Tools, but it was also an opportunity to kind of break with metaphors that we were using and reimagine what things would look like when you had to have a lot more resources going on in the product. So Peter sat down with Mark Jeffrey, who I mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. Mark's a really clever guy, and he is also a really good idea guy. And he had a lot of ideas about how a multiple channel digital audio workstation might look. And he and Peter were very like minds about these things. So they sat down and more or less hammered out, kind of the functionality that was needed and how it would basically work. And the challenge was that from a technology perspective, we were kind of taking a step backwards and being back on the bleeding edge, because while Sound Tools could fairly reliably handle, two channels of audio at 48 kilohertz, suddenly going to 4 channels, and especially with the additional signal processing that was needed, that became a challenge. Hard drives that could do 4 channels were barely available. I mean, and you combine that with the thermal recalibration problems, and 4 channels was really, really, really touchy. And then you try to get the poor CPU to do all the work needed to do the signal processing for 4 channels, and it became really, really difficult. And so we were trying to kind of measure the state of the art, really, of the available technology that was out there, and work towards being able to make use of it. And one of the things that we had done with Sound Tools is we had taken the hardware and the engine that ran Sound Tools, the audio engine, and we had not open sourced that, but we had made it available to third-party developers. We started a third-party developer program, basically.
Right.
Originally with the engine, and then we added on the hardware. And the first people that used the engine was actually Opcode Systems. If you remember, they actually produced what I believe was probably the first combination of MIDI sequencing and digital audio. This was even before Pro Tools, and it was called Studio Vision or Audio Vision or something.
I thought that was way later, Evan. I thought because I remember, Studio Vision. So there was a sequencer, which was Vision, and then they had Studio Vision. But I thought that was much later. So there you go. That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah. No, it wasn't. They were the first people to use the engine, and actually it was really easy to do because Dave and Ray had their company Opcode in the same business park that we were in.
Right.
And
okay.
so it was literally a walk across the parking lot, and so we were able to work really closely with them and make sure that everything was working together really well, and and they had their proficiencies in sequencing and MIDI interfaces and everything, and we had our proficiencies in the digital audio end and in digital audio hardware, and so it was a good fit because we weren't stepping on each other's toes.
Yep.
And we weren't in a situation to start trying to challenge them in the MIDI sequencer arena for any reason. So that was the first use of it. But one of the other early uses of it was a company called OSC. And I think they were up in San Francisco. And what they did is they wrote I think they even got it at an even lower level than our engine. And they wrote a very, very efficient, compact, 4-channel only digital audio recorder.
Yep.
DAW.
Yep.
And it had really basic signal processing, but it worked with the amount of signal processing that was available in one of our cards, and ran fairly reliably on most of the hard drives that were available. So they had really spent a lot of time making it incredibly efficient. And so it itself wasn't exactly what we needed, because we needed things that were a bit more expandable, right? Because we had, the idea that we wanted to do is to be able to have, expandable signal processing, an expandable number of tracks, and so on and so forth. And when you make something generalized in that way, it's almost always less efficient than it is if you make something that has a fixed feature set that does only a certain, number of things in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
But they had done it, and they had a mixing desk type of graphical user interface as their interface metaphor. And what Peter and Mark had as a vision for Pro Tools was that they felt that there needed to be 2 ways of interacting with the digital audio workstation. One was that type of interface that OSC had, which was I'll just call the mixing desk metaphor, which anybody who's worked in a studio is going to be comfortable and familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
And the other way was the moving blocks of waveforms around metaphor.
Yes.
Which anybody who had been using something like Sound Tools would be intimately familiar with. And they felt that you had to do both, because what was the point of being able to work at the waveform level if you could never see any of it, right? If you don't. So they felt that you needed to be able to have both interfaces. You needed to be able to go back and forth between them seamlessly, and that they were just 2 different ways of looking at the same thing, and that each one had its time and place for when you might want to use it.
Yep.
So Pro Tools needed to have two editing metaphors. And we kind of had the basics of one with Sound Tools, although it was, not exactly what was needed for multiple tracks.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't have anything really that looked like the mixing desk metaphor, but OSC did. And we had kind of a self-imposed deadline about when we wanted to release this product, which was sometime in, I believe it was like 1991.
Mm-hmm.
This is like 2 years after Sound Tools came out.
Yes.
And the decision was made at some point that the way we would get this thing to market quickly was that we would combine OSC's Pro Tools version, I guess, of their mixing desk metaphor with a waveform metaphor application that Mark Jeffrey wrote. And that's what the software for Pro Tools would be.
Right. So it was two dedicated pieces of software.
It was, and it was a bit clunky because they were totally separate pieces of software. They were all using the same engine, obviously, and the same session data.
Yep.
But to move between them, it was a bit of a clunky process, and Apple didn't really have the operating system software set up really well to move between multiple applications sharing a data set at that point. But it did get us out to market when we wanted to go out. And at that point in time, there was a single hardware card that supported 4 channels. It had, I can't remember. It had 2 signal processors on it instead of the single one that Sound Tools had on it.
Yep.
But that's what it was. It was a 4-channel only system. And it used, it had 2 applications. One was called Pro Deck, which was the OSC software. And the other was called Pro Edit. And that was the Digidrums waveform editing software that Mark had.
Right. Yep.
And there was a hardware card that went along with it. And that was the original Pro Tools product.
Yes. And I do actually remember that product because, I was working for an operation here in Melbourne that was right in the front line of all of that early Pro Tools development and marketing. And even though at the time, I was on my Atari and I was what we call the in-house MIDI specialist. I was surrounded by the Macintosh and that whole Pro Tools stuff. So that's why the deck. I remember the deck software quite distinctly because you guys moved away from it in Pro Tools 2. So I think that was a major shift for you guys because that's where you wrote the software in-house yourself. So can you give us some overview on that part of the timeline?
Yeah, that was a difficult time. I think in hindsight, we probably wish we did not release it as 2 separate software products from 2 different companies. But it's easy to beat yourself up in hindsight. But the fact is we could not have gotten it out on that timeline had we not done it. So
right. Yeah.
I don't really want to revisit it in that respect.
Right. Okay.
But it became pretty obvious after a while that it wasn't tenable for Digi as a company to support a product that a major piece of it was written by a totally separate company.
Yep.
It was just from it's not that it didn't work or anything, but just from a practical perspective, it's very difficult to align people's priorities and to get a uniform sort of customer service response like, oh, well, if you're having problems with this part of the product, you need to call this company. And if you're having problems with this other part, you need to call this company.
Yep.
And that's just let's just say it was less than ideal.
Yeah. Well, that's currently what pretty much any product support department of a software or a hardware company nowadays, whether it's because they're using, you've got a third-party piece of software and a third-party audio interface, and let me tell you, the fingers are pointing each way. Right, so if there's a problem, and if they can, they'll point the finger at the other guy.
It is horrible, and we have all been on that side of the equation as users, right? We've all had that horrible experience of the finger pointing and not getting anything resolved, and I've had that experience additionally on the manufacturer's end of trying to bring satisfaction to users when we actually had no control over the problems that they were seeing. So it cut both ways, and it wasn't good for anybody. And as you said, regardless, we're all on that boat now because of plugins.
So that's a whole other show. Yeah,
it really is. But I think plugins are kind of a distinctly different universe than the kind of main operating software, right? There's a certain part of an application that people understand that it's a third party thing you're bringing in. But I think people expect that the main user interface of what you're doing is something that's kind of the responsibility of the company that's selling it.
Yep.
And so the expectations were different, and for all of these reasons and more, it became obvious to us pretty quickly that we had to make a change, and the only real possible solution was for us to bring the whole effort in-house.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't remember exactly what went into each version of Pro Tools, but I'm pretty sure that one of the next versions, maybe it was Pro Tools 2, was basically that having happened. It was the bringing in-house of the deck end of it and unifying them rather than being two applications. They were two windows in one application and would work seamlessly together. And
that's the core of what became what everyone recognizes as Pro Tools now. And the core fundamentals are still there, Evan.
Yes.
Anyone who's used Pro Tools back in the 90s, I mean, you've got two screens, you've got a mixer and you've got an arrange page. That's it.
Right.
And that core functionality still remains to this day, which is quite amazing. And look, and things kind of moved pretty quickly from there. So, from 2 to 2.5 to 3, you guys went with, the DAE engine. That's a Digidesign audio engine. Is that correct? The DAE?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then AAE is the later one, but that's with the Avid audio engine. But DAE and the TDM. So the TDM was the DSP acceleration for the processing, correct?
TDM stands for time division multiplexing, and it's a technology that was used to implement the digital interconnect between all the pieces of hardware in the system.
Right. So that was running off the DSP, correct?
Well, it interconnected the cards that the DSPs were on.
Right.
So the TDM bus itself was implemented by a custom chip that an engineer at Digidrums designed, and it allowed basically all the DSPs to talk to each other so that you could use them as kind of general resources in the system.
Yes. Yeah. And that was another game-changing thing that. Just how integrated the DSP side of Pro Tools was directly with the mixer and the I/O and the monitoring and all of that. And again, it's something that base that has still been maintained right up until this point. So that's we're talking 25 years on more, and that all of that core functionality that they introduced back then is still an integral part, which is quite amazing. But that again, that's going to be the next show with Mark, with the whole Pro Tools history stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because your tenure at Digidesign ended not far away from so we had Pro Tools 2 and 3, and I think there there wasn't a lot more. I mean, everything was accelerating in the rate that, it's moving from new bus to PCIX and all of that type of stuff. And, DSP plugins and all the rest of it. But your tenure kind of ended around that mid-90s. So what year was that, Evan?
It was 96 when I officially left the company. Right. This was about a year and a half after the AAVIM acquisition.
See, and that was another interesting point. I know the AAVIM name change was around 2010. So for me, look, the company's always going to be Digidesign. I don't care that they renamed themselves AAVIM but I was really genuinely surprised that the AAVIM association goes back to 1995. Actually, it was. I think you said it was even earlier than that. But
it was a lot earlier. Yeah.
Yeah. So the acquisition was 1995, and they maintained the Digidesign brand right up to 2010. So that was interesting in itself. So you left about a year after the AAVIM acquisition. Was Peter still around at that point, or
he had left a few months before I did?
Wow. Okay. So the two the two co-founders had actually left the building by mid-90s. Well, yep. Look. This whole show is. This is about Digidesign in the early years, Evan. So what I mean. If you want to give us a little bit of a view of what you're feeling on how the products actually developed after you left, and how they became, like core industry standards for the longest time. Did you have any kind of feeling on what transpired after you left? I mean, we don't have to go into any great detail.
I don't actually know a lot about what transpired after I left.
Right.
I stuck around in a consultant capacity for, I don't know, probably 3 or 4 years after that, just to basically finish some products that I had been working on at the time I was leaving, so I didn't want to leave anybody in the lurch.
Right. Okay.
And so I had a little bit of visibility as to what was going on, but the major thing that I saw and that I was kind of vocal about before I left was following the Moore's Law extension and seeing that CPUs were getting so powerful that they were starting to be able to obviate the need for hardware in a lot of cases. And then, you could extend that logic to imagining what it would be like if it could obviate the need for all hardware. At the time that I was leaving, we were able to do things in software that previously we had to do in hardware. And so one of the projects that I was working on at the time I was leaving was a software version of Sample Cell.
Right. Yes.
And you may remember Sample Cell. So that was a sampler hardware sampler.
Yep.
that fit onto originally a NuBus card and ended up getting a TDM interface so it would integrate digitally into Pro Tools. And
Yep.
It was actually a really nice product. And it occurred to me at some point before I left that the computers were probably getting fast enough that we could do a software emulation of it. And so I started working on that, and that was one of the projects that I finished after I left. And but it in my role as a CTO or as a technological visionary, one of my jobs was to kind of look ahead and to imagine, what did that mean for us? What new possibilities would the future bring? What challenges would bring? What is it that we could be doing now to prepare for them? What is it that we're doing now that might be obsoleted by them? These were the kind of things that were on my plate.
Yep.
So I spent some time before I left putting together white papers and so on that would kind of lay out what I was seeing in terms of CPU power increasing and what that meant for systems that we had, where you suddenly had to have both native CPU processing and hardware acceleration working together.
Yes,
that was the challenge in the mid '90s.
Yeah, and you know what? They're still navigating it now.
They absolutely are. They absolutely are.
Except it's flipped around now that the native horsepower far exceeds the actual DSP horsepower, which is an interesting conversation in itself. You know,
it is. Yeah. It is, and a lot of that was pretty predictable. But the challenge back then in the mid '90s was very clear that at that point in time you actually could do a bit. You know, you could do functional work with the CPU now.
Yep.
But you couldn't do it all. And so you were going to have the situation where you had to have both of them there. And that created tremendous problems, primarily in terms of latency.
Yep.
Lining things up. How do you have systems that work together from a CPU and from a hardware DSP? And how do you make those things extensible and practical and so on and so forth?
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I was seeing when I was leaving, and I knew that was kind of going to be the one of the big challenges anyway going forward.
Yeah, and you're 100% correct. You know, and you know the whole battle between DSP and native. You know, I picked up the ball on the other end. You know, I've been known for one of the guys that actually pushed the native horsepower from the mid noughties. You know, I've been the guy. So and at low latencies as well. So there's periods of time where I've had close friends that were high up at Digidesign at the time that would come up to me and say, "Hey, we've been reading all of these reports that you've been popping up with this dual Xeon thing of yours running at 32 samples. Can we come and grab the machine and test it?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure." So it's you definitely were on the, your vision definitely came to pass. Let's put it that way. Hey, I just remembered something that came up in our pre-chat that I thought was really interesting because my perspective is coming from, which is different. It's coming from a Windows perspective, from a different operating system perspective. And I asked the question of whether there was any interest in porting Pro Tools earlier on to another platform. And you told me an interesting story about Next with Steve Jobs. So can you share that with us just really quickly?
Sure. Trying to remember exactly when this was.
It would have been I don't know, around 91 to 93, somewhere around there.
It was probably more around like 1990.
Right. Okay. Oh, really early. Yeah.
Yeah. Steve Jobs paid us a visit. He had just started working with Next. And he and his head engineer, a fellow named Bud Tribble, came by our offices in Palo Alto and were essentially evangelizing that we should consider porting sound tools to the Next machine.
Right. Okay.
And it seemed an obvious sort of port because the Next machine had a Motorola 56,000, had the same processor that we were originally using in Sound Tools for DSP.
Yep.
And so we wouldn't have to do a card. It had high quality audio output, and it had a high resolution bitmap screen. And so it seemed like it wasn't such a far leap. And Steve felt, probably rightly so, that it would legitimize the machine in different markets than it was originally or currently being marketed in and so forth. And so, we listened to his pitch and thought about it. And Peter and I talked about it, but ultimately we decided that it didn't make any sense for us to do for, obvious reasons. There was no installed market for it. And also that we were playing in a universe that wasn't just us, right? It was, there were lots of MIDI tools available on the Mac, and people were using the Mac as kind of a Swiss Army knife, and
Yes.
and the next platform, it wasn't there already, and we had some similar conversations about BOS and the Amiga and literally every other platform that came out there. It was the same kind of a conversation. The Next was a bit more compelling, because Steve is also another one of those guys that's very hard to say no to.
I bet.
No, he was a tremendous pitchman, and he fervently believed in what he was doing, which we really respected, because we were very much the same in that regard. We were very much tied into what we were doing, and had to evangelize a lot about. Originally anyway, about the idea that editing sound digitally was superior to doing it via analog. And I don't know if I told you this story, but there was this classic moment at one of the very first trade shows we went to. This was like, I think I had just figured out that you could play audio in real time off of a hard drive, continuous audio. And I had rigged up a version of Sound Designer. It was called Sound Designer 2 back then, I guess, to actually do that. So we had some kind of long speeches or something like that on disc, and I was basically showing people the very first nonlinear editing, right? Off of a hard drive.
Yep.
And this is when I had my custom DSP card that I had designed and stuff like that. So it's just the very beginning of this. And so we were at a trade show, and I was giving a demo to this older gentleman who had obviously been in the industry, for longer than I had been alive. And he was watching my demonstration. It's just me and him. He was watching this demonstration with tremendous interest. And he's very polite, and he waits until I'm done, and he turns to me, and he had this deep gravelly voice I'll never forget, and he says, "Sonny, this is all very interesting, but I got to tell you, you got it backwards." And I said, "I don't understand. In which way do I have it backwards?" He says, "Sonny, time doesn't run from left to right. It runs from right to left." And it took me aback, because I had to sit there and think about it for a second. But he was absolutely right, because when you edit on tape, which obviously I hadn't done for a little while, time runs from right to left on a tape.
Yes.
Right.
But on a screen, the audio goes from left to right. And what in that moment, what it made me realize was that you just can't run roughshod over an existing industry and change a paradigm out from under people's feet, and that it was going to be some combination of an educational process or a generational shift, or both.
Yeah.
And people who had spent their entire life learning how to edit on tape really weren't going to see any advantage to relearning how to do what they already knew how to do.
Yeah. Well, you know what was the kind of bridge between, tape and digital audio workstations for those fellas, and that was the ADAT.
Yes.
Right? The ADAT and the DA88. Oh yeah, mate, we'll stick with the tape, but it's digital. So I've just put that voice on. Sorry, I'm not very.
That was beautiful, Vin.
Thanks, man.
The ADAT single-handedly extended the life of tape by probably a decade at least.
And mate, have I got some stories for that one? But you know what? I'm actually going to reserve that, because I'm hoping to get the man responsible for the ADATs onto the show. So I'm going to reserve that conversation with him.
All right.
Oh boy. Hey. Now you took a bit of a hiatus for a while from the industry, and but you're back. You want to tell us about your new project? Because when you told me about it, and I looked it up, I went, that looks awesome. So do you want to give us a bit of a heads up on? Evan Brooks is back into the music technology department.
Well, I'd like to think I was never away, but
well, you know what I mean. Sorry.
Always in my head, there's always something going on.
All right.
But you know, a lot of these things are opportunity related, right? And about, I don't know, a number of years ago, a dear friend of mine approached me, who I've always wanted to work with, and he and a partner had developed a digital percussion controller using force sensing resistors, and it itself had come out of a consulting project that they had done that I think didn't happen the way it was originally going to happen, and they ended up with this technology, and we're trying to think of something to do with it, and they came up with a percussion controller,
right?
And it was, you know, very exquisitely pressure sensitive and so on and so forth, and played really nicely with hands and with sticks. And they had been using a commercially available digital audio engine to allow it to play sounds. And the way the whole thing worked is that the hardware that they had developed was literally just a bunch of sensors, and it hooked up to an iOS device, whether it was a phone or an iPad or whatever. And the iOS device read all the sensor information, and the iOS device is what was responsible for generating all the sound.
Right.
So they had this iOS software that they were buying that was an audio engine, and they were using it to play samples when the drum surface was struck. And after a while, it was clear that it wasn't all they wanted it to be in terms of the software capabilities. And so my friend says to me, can you teach me how to write a digital audio engine? Because you've obviously written a few of them. And I thought about it, and I said, yeah, certainly I could, but it'd probably be faster for me just to do it myself for you. And so I wasn't doing anything else at the time. Or actually, I was doing something else at the time, but it was a good point for me to be stopping that particular project. And so I jumped into it with both feet and wrote a digital audio engine from scratch and made it. It was very different than what was out there. It wasn't your typical sampler engine, and it was very, very unusual and flexible. And it turned the product into a really interesting and compelling instrument from what it had been before, which was kind of there wasn't a lot of distinction originally from any other kind of a digital drum pad that you might be able to go out and get and
yeah. Well, when you initially told me about it, the first thing that came to my mind was, remember the original Korg wave drum? But I mean, that was like mid '90s, the Korg wave drum. But that was the first time I saw something very similar. But this is far more extensive than that. But that was my initial impression when I first got it. I'm going, oh yeah, it's something like a wave drum. And but then you kind of filled me in that it's far more advanced than than that initial idea.
Yeah, there's been a lot of products throughout time that are basically drum pad triggers where it would sense you hitting a pad and then it would play a sample or a synthesized sound or something. So that in itself wasn't that unique. But my buddy John Worthington, who I was working with, he's had a lifetime of experience in the computer and audio world. He was when I met him, he was at Apple working on the Apple IIGS,
right,
which was Apple's attempt at making kind of an Amiga, I guess, where it had a lot of emphasis on graphics and sound, the GNES.
Right. Yep.
And John later went on to do a whole lot of things, including he wrote the MIDI manager for Apple, and he managed the first QuickTime team, and
right. Okay.
So he's been in this business a long time.
Yep.
And so he was able to take what I was doing and to imagine something greater than what they had originally started out doing. And he and his partner Mark Bain, who designed the hardware, decided that we'd try to make this thing into a more complex device than what was originally imagined.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, it's become what I would call a performance synthesizer, which is I don't know if it's a new category of instrument, but it's really a player's instrument. It's designed. I don't know how to. It's very hard to describe. I am if nothing else, I am not a marketing person. So
we should tell everyone what the actual product is.
The product's called Jambe.
Yep.
And if you just look at it, it looks like a wooden rimmed drum head with 10 areas on the surface that you can hit.
Yes. Yeah.
But that really kind of belies the complexity. It's tremendously modifiable. It utilizes all the sensors, for example, in the iOS device. So all the magnetometers and accelerometers and gyroscopes are all available to modify the playing experience. So, for example, you could be playing it, and one of the things we like to do is to wear a magnetic ring, which you can get from your local magic supply store for $1. And then your hand becomes a theremin-like modifier to the sounds that you're playing in real time. So, or you can hold the drum as you're playing it, and as you're spinning around and dancing around on stage, or moving or shaking or spinning, the sound responds to the movement you're making.
So you've got some theremin elements in it by just wearing a magnetic ring.
Right. So just to use that specific example, the theremin is different than most other instruments because it's what I'd call a performance instrument.
Yeah.
And so we extend that in a lot of different ways in Jambe. So, for example, in Jambe, there's a lot of emphasis, for example, on having multiple people being able to play the same instrument simultaneously.
Oh.
So there's collaborative aspects to it.
Okay.
There's shared performance aspects to it. A lot of what we're doing now focuses on control. So, for example, you could, as part of a performance, it's meant to be a performance instrument. You can control, let's say, your lighting or your stage equipment or other devices through various means from within the Jambe interface itself. So you're not just playing sounds; you're also conducting the aspects, the audio-visual, physical aspects of the performance itself.
Ah, amazing.
I just looked it up, and that is such a cool instrument. I love this.
Yeah. Hey, what was what's the processor that is actually driving that unit?
Oh, I don't know the exact name of it. It's just a very, very tiny microcontroller that's inside. That's
so it's not. Is it an FPGA?
I don't believe there's any FPGA in there. I think it's just a single chip microcontroller with a little bit of support circuitry.
Right. Okay. So there's no like a little ARM or something like that. There's no processor in there.
Well, there is. There's a microprocessor in there, and its job is to basically read the pressures on all the pads. The pressures are read 1,000 times a second, so every millisecond there's a new pressure, and they're pretty detailed. So the pressures are, I believe, 10 bits.
Right.
So it's 1,000 different pressure levels that are sensed. So it's very sensitive, and you can play it equally well with your fingertips or with sticks. You can really beat on it and get a huge dynamic range, or you can play very, very delicately with fingers.
Yeah. Oh, awesome.
So Vin, it's different class of processor than when you or somebody else says ARM. They're usually thinking about what's in Apple products and stuff like that these days,
or even what's in a mobile phone.
Right. So ARM also does microcontroller stuff as well. So these tend to be much lower power, lower capability devices, but really good for real-time processing.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, awesome. Well, there you go. Yeah. So look, that product really impressed me, Evan, when you were telling me about that, and look, it's great that you're back in the saddle, so to speak. Even though you did say that you hadn't really left, but this is probably one of the first products that you've been more intimately involved with. Am I correct there? Or
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
and it kind of it meets my need for creativity and for it's that whole inventors thing where you're driven to create things that don't exist already. And I've spent so many years of my life kind of making tools for musicians that it's really hard to stop, and it's very gratifying to be able to have a platform to continue that work.
Yeah, look, I mean, that's brilliant. Look, for people that to actually come up with something outside of the box nowadays is not easy, because people think that, look, everything's been done. Well, it hasn't, obviously. Look, I worked in the 90s with a fellow that made a thing called a light harp, and I don't even know whether it actually became commercially available. I know he handmade some of these things, and it was actually a harp, but it was with lasers. There was
right.
So he'd be playing this thing in midair, and it was sending out all this MIDI data. It was absolutely amazing performance instrument. I don't even know what actually.
Very Jean-Michel Jarre type stuff.
Yeah, I don't even know what ended up happening with that. But now that my memory's just been triggered, I'm going to have to look it up to see if actually anything ever eventuated with that thing. There you go.
That's a great instrument. That's a brilliant use of the technology.
Yeah, and and he was hand making them. It was just a fella in Melbourne. I can't remember his name. I do apologise if he actually stumbles on the podcast and listens in. But I only worked with him for a short amount of time, and he was just this amazing, creative guy that was thinking outside of the box, obviously. And he was explaining it to me, and I'm like. And I'm deer in the headlights going, huh? What are you doing, what? So it was kind of like a theremin type of performance aspect to it with the two hands, but it was basically he's playing a harp in midair, and this thing had some type of laser sensors that was triggering all of the performance data. So there you go.
This is in a class of instruments like the air drums were. This is do you remember the air drums back in the early 80s? Yeah, amazing stuff. Hey, if I may, can I get your thoughts on the current landscape with music technology in general? Because from when, the stories that you were telling us about, you could barely get 2 tracks of audio on a hard drive, and then you're having to wait for the technology to catch up to do 4, There's a lot of listeners, the younger listeners would be going, I can't even fathom that. Look, I still remember how ecstatic I was when I could run a reverb in real time on a native processor. And people nowadays just go, oh, like what? They just don't understand because they haven't grown with the technology, So for you to have done those initial revolutionary products in the 80s and the 90s with, and fighting the technology, it would have to be a completely different environment now, wouldn't it? I mean, you've got processing power out of the yin-yang. So you do.
Can you give us some personal, insight on the differences on between then and now, and how your development, how you achieve your development now?
God, you're making me feel really old, Vin. I feel like some guy that grew up around the turn of the 20th century who'd watched the world get electricity in cars.
Hey, Evan, I think we're around the same vintage, mate. So
What I will say is that I think there's no end of making these types of comparisons, right? It's like, how many people do you know have grown up not knowing what a record is, right? Or pretty soon, some people aren't going to know what a CD was. And
well, my kids don't know what a CD. They see a CD rack, they're going, "What's that, Dad?" I'm like, "Oh, look, it's CD." What?
Oh, God. Yeah. Well, that's just normal. It's just
Yep.
It's just the way that things evolve. But I think the things that are really the tangible differences that I see from where I sit are that this is the best time that there's ever been to be somebody doing things like what I like to do, which is to create and invent, musical products and instruments. And because it's the bar to being able to do that has never been lower, and the information available to help you do that has never been greater. And in the old days, there were very few companies doing this. in large part because it was really, really hard. Writing software was a lot more difficult. There were a lot less resources available to you. It took a long time to do it because doing things like compiling something actually took a long time. You had to buy a lot of expensive machines to be able to do it. Like when we started writing Macintosh software, you didn't write the software on the Macintosh. You had to buy a Lisa computer from Apple, which was their Macintosh-like computer that they did prior. And Lisa's cost, I don't remember what they were, but they were probably $5,000 or $10,000 each or something like that. And if you think a Macintosh was slow, Lisa's were even slower. And you had to write the code on the Lisa and then write the program to a floppy drive inside the Lisa, which you then popped out of the Lisa and stuck over into a Mac and then booted the Mac. And it was just such a laborious process. And now you have a situation where, everybody and their uncle are learning coding as a kid, that the resources to help with coding are just widely available all over the internet, in every nook and cranny of the ether out there, and that development systems are readily available. Apple's Xcode development system is just so much better than what we had 30 years ago. There's just no comparison. And so for people who want to be able to do this kind of stuff, there's never been a better time. And then you have to go look at, what is this stuff running on? You've got more power in that phone in your pocket for doing digital audio software than you probably had in the most expensive, fully packed, hardware-filled Pro Tools system that was ever produced. It's literally that kind of a comparison. And so you have a situation where you've got just tremendous ease of being able to create these products and platforms to run them on that are inexpensive, plentiful, super powerful, and widely available. And that's nirvana, for anybody that likes to create things in this space. So that's the really big difference that I see.
Yeah, no, of course. Well, there you go. I think that we're over that. Where are we? We're over that 2-hour mark, guys. I think. Look, this has been great, but I think we should put a pin in it now. And Evan is more than welcome to come back again. But
definitely.
I think we should just wind it up now for the day, and I'm going to thank both of you guys for your time and energy, and let's pencil in another future get together when we can chew the fat over the whole music tech area again. And Evan, can you hear this?
I hear it.
You know what that is? That's me ticking off another one off my bucket list.
Excellent.
Because the Music Pioneer shows are essentially my bucket list of shows for people that have been true music pioneers and had a great influence in what I've experienced over the years. And look, that was awesome. And thank you again for taking the time and energy. And that's another tick. And I think with that, on to the next.